Now I want to talk about what we're all up against as a movement, in terms of what working people are up against at the moment. Because when this government came to power, they attacked anyone who criticised what they were going to do as deficit deniers. And yet everything we said would happen has come to pass. Not that we can take any joy from that, given the awful human consequences of cuts and of austerity with communities right across the country. When it comes to the deficit, that key test of theirs, well, the underlying deficit is going up. And in fact, one of the ways they fiddled the figures was in terms of the amount they get from the sale of 4G, which today, predictably, has come £1 billion below what they projected it would be. The debt is piling up day after day after day. And that is because they sucked demand out of the economy, people have stopped spending money, and tax revenues have gone down because of the lack of growth and the lack of confidence. These are things, again, that we said would happen, and PCS crucially said would happen right from the outset of this crisis, and long before Cameron and Clegg had their loving in the Rose Garden. And of course, growth. I mean, if we look at this crisis that we're currently faced with, I don't know if people remember, Labour did a poster, they mocked up a poster the last election. It was of David Cameron as Gene Hunt from Life on Mars, smugly perching on an Audi Quattro. And it said, don't let him bring us back to the 1980s. This is a far worse economic crisis in the 80s. It's more protracted than the last double-dip recession of the 1970s. It is even more protracted than the Great Depression of the 1930s. There is no crisis as long on record in modern British history as the one we're currently in. And that is all down to the self-defeating austerity. But when I say self-defeating, of course, that's almost to suggest that all this is really about is balancing the books, admittedly on the shoulders of working people, the unemployed, disabled people, poor people, and so on. But it isn't about that. And I have to say, we underestimated David Cameron in opposition. He was just dismissed as this shallow salesman, all style and no substance, who pounced about the Arctic with huskies, who wanted to hug hoodies and all the rest of it. But he's leading a radical government that is changing Britain and people's lives dramatically. They're going further than Thatcher could have even dreamt of. Whether it be the privatisation of our National Health Service, which they didn't even have the guts to put to the British people because they know they would be massacred for it, as the Tory Chancellor Nigel Lawson said in the 1980s, the NHS is the closest the English have to a religion. And I was at my local hospital, the Whittington Hospital in Archway, which at the moment is facing cuts and a privatisation as a direct result of those government policies. And they've used this crisis as an opportunity. They've turned a crisis of the market and they've turned it into a crisis of public spending, even though the banks and the wealthiest people in society were responsible for the mess we're in. They have used it to dust off plans they know otherwise they could have never dreamt of putting to the British electorate, dreams which the Conservatives have always held, massacring the state, attacking the NHS, attacking workers' rights, and they've done it with the cover of this economic crisis. But it remains boom time for the people at the top. They have never had it so good. And the Sunday Times each year do a rich list of the top 1,000 people in Britain, the top richest people in Britain. Last year their wealth went up again. The year before that it went up by nearly a fifth. The year before that it went up by 30%. It's the biggest jump ever recorded in the history of the rich list. So when they say there's no money in Britain, there's huge amounts. But it's all concentrated in the bank accounts of the people at the top, whilst ordinary working people are getting poorer year on year. But what I think has disgusted me most about this government, and I'll level with you, there's quite a long list of competitors for that, but it has been a deliberate attempt by this government to turn people's anger away from the people who landed us in this mess in the first place to people's neighbours down the streets. The working poor against the unemployed over benefits. Non-disabled people against disabled people, again over benefits. Private sector workers against public sector workers over pensions, terms and conditions. And each time they do it, the argument is always the same. You've been mugged, and therefore your less deserving neighbour should be mugged as well. And it is a cynical attempt at divide and rule politics. And I just want to throw a few ideas about, when we talk about welfare spending being too high in this country, might be an odd thing to say, but the government have a point. It's not to do with a bunch of lazy scroungers dribbling on sofas in mansions made out of widescreen television sets, watching Jeremy Kyle on repeat whilst 50 kids run around. The reason we've got such a high welfare bill, if you like, is a triple crisis. It's the housing crisis, the low wages crisis, and the jobs crisis. So the taxpayers get every right to be angry about the billions of pounds of taxpayers' money that has been wasted on housing benefit. It's jumped under this government by £2 billion now. It's £23 billion a year. But that's not going in the pockets of the tenants. That is lining the pockets of wealthy landlords who are charging extortionate rents because governments didn't build council housing and because we haven't controlled rents in this country. If we built council housing, we'd create jobs, we'd stimulate the economy, we'd bring down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list, but at the same time, we'd bring down the amount of money that has been literally lining the pockets of landlords. We should stop calling housing benefit and call it what it is, landlord subsidy. Now, one thing that I'd really like to emphasise, which is a new project, a new initiative, which PCS are behind, is called the People's Assembly. Now, the People's Assembly has been backed by a range of unions, including Unite, PCS, Euston, hopefully the GMB in time, the RMT, and so on. There's going to be a big day on June the 21st, but in the build-up to that, it's going to bring together unions, community groups, campaigners on disability rights, tax justice campaigners, just local community activists, to help build a broad front of people in parties or none who actually want to get out there and start actually making the case against austerity. And that is something that I really recommend people bear in mind. That's coming up, and that is something which I think is important, because the biggest movement we have in this country at the moment is the yelling at the television movement, people screaming in frustration but not knowing what to do. And the idea is to have people's assemblies right across the country where people can come together, whether it be low-paid workers having their tax credits cut, disabled people having their benefits taken away, young people who can't get a job, and so on. That is going to be a broad coalition, and it's something which is coming up which I really recommend keeping your eye on. And the other thing is, I'm working with a think tank called Class, which PCS and Unite and others have set up, and that's bringing together economists and academics. It's not just another bloody think tank, which was my first reaction. It's the idea is to bring together these experts to help flesh out an alternative which we as a movement can get around and actually give people confidence to fight back. So what I'd say really to end up is the way we get change in this country isn't through the goodwill and generosity of the people at the top. It's through the struggle and sacrifice of people from below. That's how we've won everything. Every right that we have in this country has come through that. And my favourite quote is by this African-American statesman from the 19th century called Frederick Douglass. And he said, "Power conceives nothing without a demand, it never did and it never will." And what he meant by that was it was just working people and others getting together and fighting back that forced people, whether they liked it or not at the top, to give in to what their demands were. And that's something as a movement we have to bear in mind. That is how we win things, by fighting, not by expecting change to happen through the goodwill and generosity of those at the top. This is not a strong government, and if we build a strong movement and we stand together as people being hit by this austerity offensive, we can win. We stand together, we fight together, and we will win together. Thank you.